Robert Keifer joins me this week to discuss brewing beer with gluten-free grains. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 171. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 171, and it's late May 2018. This week, Robert Keifer joins me to discuss brewing with gluten-free grains. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They're running an amazing deal right now. Get 20% off your subscription when you use the offer code BeerSmith2018. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers, and you can read my new column called Ask the Experts. Take advantage of their special deal when you use the offer code BeerSmith2018 at beerandbrewing.com. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And also the new BrewVision thermometer from Blickman Engineering. This interactive wireless digital thermometer connects right to your iPhone or iPad and lets you remotely monitor and record temperatures. You can download recipes directly from the BeerSmith cloud and get updates and alerts as you brew. Get the BrewVision Bluetooth thermometer today, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. Again, that's BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith Mobile. The mobile version of BeerSmith is a perfect complement to our desktop brewing software. It includes all the tools you need to create recipes on the go, share them with your friends, and acts as a pocket brew timer. Check out BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile or on Google Play, iTunes, or the Amazon app stores. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, I welcome Robert Keifer. Robert has a lot of experience in gluten-free brewing using alternative grains, and he's going to also present at this year's HomebrewCon in Portland. Today, he joins us to discuss how to make beer from gluten-free grains, which is something I've never done. Robert, it is great to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks again, Brad.
So this is your first time on the show, and actually this is my first time talking with anybody that really seriously about making gluten-free beer, so I'm hoping I'll learn a lot here. Can you start by discussing what gluten is and why some people are sensitive to it?
Yeah, so gluten is a combination of two different proteins in a couple different grasses protein chain. So it's a combination of glutenin and gliadin, and then they form together to make a gluten. You typically need a gluten network for bread to rise in typical bread baking.
So I assume many of the grains we commonly use probably have a lot of gluten in them, right?
Yes. Three of the big ones, wheat, barley, and rye, are the three that are not on my list anymore in terms of brewing.
So I assume you're gluten sensitive, right?
Yeah, it's kind of tough to say. I mean, I don't have the diagnosis of celiac, but I have various symptoms that are kind of in line with that gluten intolerance.
And what kind of I'm just curious. What kind of symptoms do people get? How do you know if you're sensitive to it?
There's a lot of different symptoms, and so it actually is tough. 1 in 4 people today that have a gluten intolerance have been previously diagnosed with IBS, and that's typically one of the quickest ways to find out if you're gluten intolerant or not. If you have massive indigestion when you eat products that contain gluten. For most people in general, gluten is a very hard to digest protein anyways, so most people's bodies just passes it on and doesn't really deal with it anyways. Certain people like myself, my body will go into an autoimmune response, which involves inflammation, asthma, eczema, various different types of indigestion, also severe weight gain.
Oh, wow. So it's almost like an allergy, right? But even worse because you're ingesting it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Weird. I mean, there are certain people that even have it as severe as people with, say, peanut allergies. Yeah.
Well, before we jump into the grain alternatives, I did want to mention, can you talk for a minute about brewing a conventional beer and then using enzymes like there's one called Clarity Firm or Clarex.
Yeah.
I think it comes from White Labs to break down the gluten. And I know some people are able to successfully brew using that, right?
Yeah, and it's it's definitely gained a lot of traction. One of the things that I can say that I like about it is that it has brought attention to gluten-free diets and just really removing gluten from your diet in general. So basically how it works is you brew your regular beer. At the time that you're pitching the yeast, you throw in Clarity Firm, and what it does is it attacks the specific proline amino acids in the gluten chain. So it's hard to say whether or not it removes gluten. it merely reduces the ability of the testing equipment to be able to find the gluten because you basically have chopped up gluten pieces in solution.
So it breaks down the longer chemical chains, right?
Yes, exactly.
It's an enzyme, so I mean that's what it does, right?
Exactly, and it's specifically targeting that proline amino acid within the sequencing for the gluten protein.
And so some people that are less sensitive to gluten, I mean, that actually works. You can brew a regular beer and add a little bit of enzyme to it and potentially drink it, right?
True. Yeah. I mean, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for people like me. I still am symptomatic even when I drink gluten-reduced beers. So I've now really looked to stay away from those, and that's why I've gone, really full bore, 100% into this zero tolerance gluten-free homebrewing.
So we've covered that. Let's jump into actually how you brew beer without any gluten in it. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah. So there's a lot of different ways to go about it. I would basically start by, you could figure out the style that you want to do, or maybe you can just find what you have, because sorghum syrup, brown rice syrup, as well as the various different beet sugars and candy syrups, those are all available online at your local homebrew store. So that's a lot of times a really easy way to get started. So you can kind of get that experience underneath your belt of actually brewing a gluten-free beer successfully. Then from there, where you can go is different styles. So like cereal mash with unmalted, or you could do cereal mash with malted and a partial mash. You could even do all grain and various different methods and styles within that same category.
Right, but we're going to avoid using any barley, right? No barley, no wheat, and what was the other? No rye, right?
Yeah, no rye. I would also say to avoid triticale or spelt as well, as they aren't necessarily high gluten containers, but they still do have gluten in them.
Oh, really? I thought people were using spelt in some cases.
And
No?
I have actually used it, but one of the things that I found out from people that have a little bit higher sensitivity or actual full celiac, they've instructed me that I could actually be, if I'm telling people to use that grain, I could be causing unwanted damage. And so for me, where I draw the line when it comes to enjoyment is when it's affecting people's health.
Right. What are the most popular alternative base grains? What do we actually start with? Now, I know they come in a number of different forms. We talk about syrups and all that stuff, but what are the base grains that you primarily would use to make a gluten-free beer?
Yeah, so the most popular ones that I see are rice, millet, sorghum, buckwheat, and quinoa. Those are the top, and then you have some other adjuncts within there. Some oats that you can source are certifiably gluten-free, so those are a great adjunct as well. You can buy malted oats, but typically they're not going to be gluten-free, so it's a tough trade-off there. That's why I typically, would stick to those first five: the rice, millet, sorghum, buckwheat, and then quinoa if you can.
Oh, buckwheat. You can use buckwheat too?
Yeah, it's funny because it has wheat in the name, but it's a seed. It's not even a grass. And the easiest way to actually find buckwheat is in its honey form because it comes from a flower. But you can still buy both unmalted groats as well as malted buckwheat seeds.
And are all these grains available in a malted form, or do you typically buy them in an unmalted form, or syrups? What are you working with?
Yeah, you can pretty much find all three of those nowadays. Glutenfreehomebrewing.com, or which used to be glutenfreehomebrewing.org, carries a vast selection. I mean, all different types of roasts. They even have crystals. They have dark roast. They have light roast, pale. They even have French roast. I mean, they're really getting sophisticated with it nowadays, and it's actually pretty exciting times. When I first discovered the website, I was in awe, basically.
That's what I was going to ask you next. How do you source the grains? So that's one place you can get them, right?
Yeah, there's there. I mean, I've gone even to Amazon. A lot of the stores like Northern Brewer, as well as Adventures in Home Brewing, Great Fermentations, they have brown rice syrup, sorghum syrup, rice syrup solids, all those different types of syrups and sugars that you can add to the brew as well.
Now, is that more typical that you would use more of an extract type method, or is it more typical that you use an all grain type of method?
Well, now that I'm almost about 3 years into brewing solely just gluten-free, I personally prefer all grain. But that's not to say that you couldn't do extract. In fact, I'm still using an extract in a lot of my brews to get the desired gravity. So I would say just, for anybody that's looking to get into this, start with extract. It's a great place to start, just like your regular homebrewing.
So walk me through what would a typical extract recipe look like? I mean, I could, certainly come up with, with a regular beer off the top of my head. What would a typical maybe extract recipe look like for a gluten-free beer?
Yeah,
something like a pale ale, maybe.
Yeah, pale ale. So I mean, we'll start at the 5-gallon level. You probably want to use about 6 pounds of sorghum syrup, and then you can use like a rice syrup solids or a brown rice syrup in varying quantities. A couple pounds probably will get you to where you want to be for a pale ale. I would say you can also incorporate different things like honeys into the mix or Belgian candy syrups and things like that. I mean, obviously adding those in the boil. One thing that I would add to that is that you're going to want to add a maltodextrin or some sort of dextrin to the mixture, because most gluten-free grains produce high levels of glucose, which is very easily fermentable by yeast strains. So I've actually finished a lot of beers at 000 or 0 degrees Plato.
Oh, yeah. So it makes sense. Much like if you're making wine or mead or something like that, they're going to basically ferment all the way out, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And so instead of actually, like I used to do, which is stack the deck in my favor so that I could, finish at a reasonable ABV, so to speak, now I'm actually playing around, and sometimes I'm underpitching or not oxygenating or other things like that so that I actually don't finish as low. It's interesting. I'm not used to that, but it does actually help give that residual body as well as that residual sweetness, so it's not too dry.
And I've done a lot of mead making in the last year. I was wondering if you could pull off the trick. In mead making, a lot of times we pull off the trick where we use maybe a lower attenuation yeast. Mm-hmm. And then actually ferment it to the point where it dies of alcohol poisoning. It has low alcohol tolerance, I should say, not low attenuation. Low alcohol tolerance yeast, and then we maybe like an English ale yeast probably has most of them have a fairly low alcohol tolerance. I was wondering if you made a higher gravity beer, if you could get away with that and leave a high finishing gravity, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. That's typically what I've chosen to do a lot of times. Like instead of having an IPA that finishes at 0.002, I'm gonna go for by using the 001 yeast strain from White Labs, I might go for a ESB or a more of like a London yeast strain to get that same kind of body or finishing gravity that you get in a more standard sense.
And you mentioned the base grains. Do you use specialty grains? I mean, you mentioned there's some roasted grains available. I mean, do you typically steep some roasted grains in there to get flavor or body in it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely necessary, especially if you are using extract, because there is that character that you are missing out. And obviously these extracts are non-diastatic as well. So it helps with that extra things that you can make the beer a little bit more enjoyable, so to speak. Instead of just calling it beer, it actually tastes like beer, and you have your friends commenting and going, "Wow, this is great."
So what are the dark grains made out of? The roasted grains, what do they use as a base?
Yeah, so I've seen roasted buckwheat. I've seen all different types of roasts on millet. Same goes for rice. There's even crystal rice. There's crystal millet. There's American roast, Munich millet malt, Vienna millet malt, chocolate roast.
So I assume you would probably just steep those like a regular. Like a regular extract type recipe?
Yeah, so like a partial mash. So doing like a cereal or some sort of like on your way up to boil, you have them in the solution for 30 minutes to an hour. Really depends on what you're going for. These grains actually do have a good protein content as well. Both millet and buckwheat are relatively high. I know that millet specifically is right around the 9 to 11% range.
Wow. And then can you walk us through, you mentioned you do all grain now. What does an all grain recipe look like, and what are some of the considerations you run into doing something like that?
Yeah, so typically most of my base and a good amount of my character is going to come from millet. And then I'm usually adding buckwheat, pale buckwheat into that mix. Buckwheat's great for head retention, as well as it also has a good amount of enzymatic activity. I also am going to add rice hulls typically. However, I have done a couple batches recently and I haven't needed it. a lot of that is because I've incorporated a step mash into my process. A lot of what I was first seeing when I first started this a couple years back, this is per the recommendation of Gluten-Free Homebrewing. At the time, they had suggested a single infusion, and now they even do a modified step. Their step mash takes about 4 hours. The one that I've instituted into my process takes about 2 hours, and then involves a 30-minute beta-glucan rest. So that really helps with that drainage because these are really gummy grains, like especially buckwheat. A lot of people are scared of using buckwheat because it can really mess up your lauter or sparge process. I personally had sparges that have taken me 4 hours alone. So that's definitely a massive consideration to make sure that you're reducing those sticky aspects of the brew.
So walk me through the mash process. You said you typically have just go to a multi-step mash, whereas obviously most of us have highly modified grains now are using a single infusion mash. I mean, are you doing extra steps to do like a cereal mash to convert some of the grains? The grains are already malted though, right? The ones you're working with are already malted, right?
Yeah, grains are malted. So that is a nice thing. There is still that consideration with the high protein levels, especially for buckwheat. So I will start at about 135 at my protein rest or beta glucan rest, and then I will ramp to about 152 for about an hour, and then I'll maybe finish up around 163 just to potentially get a little bit more sugars into the solution, and then sparge out at 168.
So I mean, it's not dramatically different than working with a regular beer, then, right?
No, it's actually really similar, and most of my starting gravities are at the all grain level are at 1050, 1060. So
I mean, that's very comparable to a regular beer, right?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that I've gotten in terms of feedback recently is that there is still good head retention when you add the actual either cereal grains or malted grains. It really does help with that better overall beer experience. You get the lacing, you get that head retention and things that a lot of people are looking for in craft beer.
Interesting. Well, what are some, well, we'll get to that in a minute, actually. Walk us through the rest of the process now. Are there any, are you doing special things during fermentation in order to allow it to ferment out? Are you using enzymes? Are you using yeast nutrients?
Yeah, I will typically add a yeast nutrient. I'm also using exoamylases as well, just to make sure that I get to a good starting gravity, because that is one of the aspects of gluten-free grains is that while they do have great fermentability, they also have an issue converting their own starches to sugars. So I'm typically going to add like a teramyl or a specific type of exoamylase to help myself get to where I need to be.
So that's an enzyme that you're using to help break down the longer sugar chains, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Is that added during the mash or is that added after?
Yeah, I added right at the beginning of the mash, so I get a full 2 hours of it being, used, and it tends to do a really good job with that amount of time for sure.
So I mean that alpha amylase, for example, is a naturally occurring enzyme in malted barley.
Yeah.
But you're telling me in many cases you have to add some in order to get the many of these grains to convert properly, right?
Yes. So there's really good beta amylase in buckwheat, and I think there's a certain quantity in millet, but that alpha amylase is definitely in very low quantities in both those grains. So it is vital, especially also with rice too. I mean, I used to use rice as my base malt when I first started doing this and wasn't getting high enough extracts. So then I kind of converted over to millet and buckwheat, and those seem to be working incredibly well for me. But that's not to say that rice isn't a great choice as well, especially since it is a lot easier to source in the United States.
Mm-hmm. So again, walk us through fermentation. Are you doing anything? I mean, I assume you do the standard kinds of things that you probably prepare a starter and you probably aerate the wort, but are you doing anything special to help enhance the fermentation or aid the fermentation?
There are times where I do like to say if I'm doing an ale, instead of going at 70, I'll go at 72 just to ensure that I've got good yeast health and activity. Mm-hmm. But even so, I'm definitely finishing beers still below 1.01. So I'm, the 3 of the beers that I kegged last night were below 005.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So I mean, those are finishing gravities you might expect from even a wine, perhaps. So fairly low. Fermentation is not a real problem then. It goes, obviously goes pretty well, right?
Yeah,
So,
it's pretty good. And I will still use a yeast nutrient or two, or maybe like I'll pour an old yeast slurry, into the last 15 minutes just to get that extra, the yeast cell walls will break down and what calcium and other things that are still in solution in that slurry will go on to the next batch and provide as like a yeast nutrient there as well.
and the fermentation times, are they similar to what you might see from a regular beer?
Typically, actually, they're shorter. From what I see, even lager strains, 7 to 9 days is what I'm typically seeing for primary.
Yeah, that's pretty quick. So it sounds like these are, break down into fairly simple sugars that then ferment pretty well, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the beer that you produce. What are some of the flavor issues you run into first? You mentioned there were a few.
Yeah. So when I first got started, one of the first things that I noticed, especially because I was using a lot of sorghum at the time because it was easy to source for me, is that there was a noticeable, and a lot of people call it a twang. So it's kind of Brett-like in nature, but it doesn't have that full cardboard or rope taste. But there is some sort of like, okay, wait, did I do something wrong, or is this how it's supposed to taste? So that is a consideration. The funny thing about that sorghum twang, and I've looked into this, is that Clarity Firm or Clarex actually helps reduce that twang. So it's got to be some sort of a protein thing within sorghum.
Yeah, it got to be a protein, but it's probably not, obviously not gluten. It's some other protein that's causing it. And you said that's lactic-like, so I assume it's got a little bit of a sour character to it?
Yeah, twangy is the best thing because it's not like acetic. It's not like it's going to make your mouth pucker, but it's going to be one of those things where you're like, oh, wait, is this on the way to spoiling, or is there something wrong here? That's typically what I hear from a lot of people. Some people have also described it a little bit more also chlorophenolic, so like chlorophenol. Maybe a little bit of Band-Aid sometimes. That's what I've picked up.
And that primarily comes from sorghum, right? Is what you said?
A lot of it does. I think there also could be a little bit to do with, brewing practices. I've also tried to do a little bit of a longer boil now. So I typically do 75-minute boils so that I help get more of that hot break going towards the end. Yeah.
Okay, so Robert, are you getting the same kind of off flavors with some of the other grains you're using? You mentioned you use rice. I think millet was a major one that you use, right, as a base grain?
Yeah, I don't really get as much off taste, but one of the things that is very true is that rice and millet both have, for their size, they've got a lot of husk, which means you can get a lot of tannic extraction from them.
Oh,
so
wow.
Temperature control is definitely a concern. I'm not letting myself go above 170 pretty much anymore. It's also because I've recently gotten into lager brewing recently, and I brewed a Pilsner that was basically unpalatable and pretty much flush worthy because of that. So
I've flushed more than my share over the years too. That's okay. I want to ask you, so temperature is important, but interestingly, I actually did some research into that whole tannin extraction thing, and pH plays a big role in that. Actually, when the running pH kind of gets too high, that's when you start to get the tannins into it. So have you looked at all into kind of managing your pH as a way of maybe managing the tannin extraction?
Absolutely, yes. So I do a water treatment before every mash. So I'm adding up to about 2 to 3 teaspoons of calcium chloride. I'm also adding gypsum to certain batches to better control that pH. And there's even considerations that I've made of adding citric acid to the mash water as well. So those are all things that you can consider. I don't personally have a water testing equipment as of yet, but that is definitely something that is very important to me and as part of my process now.
You might want to try a pH meter. And again, I haven't brewed this, so I'm just talking off the top of my head, but I would imagine if you control the pH of the mash, it's probably going to have a positive effect on that tannin extraction, because in a typical traditional batch, when the pH goes like above, let's see, I think it's around 6, goes above 6, that's when you start to get a lot of tannins. I would imagine it's probably a similar number, at least for the grains you're working with, although you got a lot more tannins in the husk, obviously.
Absolutely.
Yeah, kind of interesting.
And so, I mean, that's one of the things is like, so I used a specific style of rice there, what gluten-free homebrewing calls their gas hog or Eckert malting, which is out of Chico, California, which makes the rice malt. They call it their gas hog. And that is very dark. Like the name says it all. And you really want to try to use that in minimal quantities because I've had other beers where, yeah, it's just almost on the acrid point. So,
yeah. Now, I know you also run into issues with low body and low head retention, probably a large part because you get these fairly low finishing gravities, right?
Yes, very true. And so, yeah, I mean, if I'm kegging it, then I'm also going to increase the carbonation and other things like that. But previous to that step, I think maltodextrin is something that I mentioned before. It's super important. Trying to use grains that are going to have a higher protein content are a great idea. I mean, I've even seen people use things like chestnuts and lentils even to get your protein content higher so you get more head retention. Some people like me, I can kind of pick out those tastes a little bit quicker than the next person sometimes. So I tend to stay away from those. But yeah, so I'm using those. I'm adding a little bit of those dextrins towards the end. And then I'm also doing a lot of things like dry hopping, which does help also increase head retention as well.
Yeah, hops actually play, the polyphenols from the hops play an important role, especially in a high gravity for head retention. Yeah. So, I mean, what are some of the things you do to manage the body of the beer, though? You mentioned maltodextrin, obviously, is probably a great option, but are there any other tricks you can use?
Let's see. That one's pretty easy, and it's pretty easy to source as well. So I think some of the other things that I may suggest are going to be a little bit harder to do, like buying flaked grains. Yeah. Like I've used flaked quinoa a lot. That helps, but it's also harder to source. I've used flake corn, but it's not always the best in terms of trying to go for a style. I use a lot of flaked oats though, and it's great when I'm doing wit styles or Weissen styles, just because it does help increase the cloudiness as well as the protein content, and the overall experience of that pillowy texture that you're looking for in those styles.
Are you able to brew pretty much any style using these methods?
Absolutely. I think the only styles that I've really struggled with are the darker of the dark strains, or styles, as it were, like stouts and porters. Mm-hmm. Porters are really easy to make because a lot of porters are already, kind of dry on the dry side anyways. Yeah. Where it becomes difficult is when you're doing stouts. So you have to do a little bit more considerations during fermentation. So what I see being the largest recommendation is to add syrups during fermentation so that can increase some of that syrupy texture that a lot of stouts have, and then potentially even have a higher finishing gravity as well in the process.
So when you say you're adding syrups, are you adding fermentable syrups during? Walk through that process because I don't think that's common to regular beer makers, at least.
Yeah, no, that's true. That is a little bit of a different one. So you can do both. I mean, it's really up to you. It really what you're going for, right? I mean, I would avoid doing like.
Well, can you walk us through the method real quick? What are you doing by trying to add syrups and when do you add them and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So yeah, you're probably going to want to add them. You could add them, during fermentation. You could add them in secondary after you've already racked it off the yeast, so that you're going to finish higher. There's a lot of different ways and considerations that you can do it. Sometimes you can put it in the bottom of the secondary fermenter and you're pouring the beer on top of it and then keeping it cool so that it got into solution, but it didn't ferment, things like that. So that would be probably one of my biggest recommendations in terms of how I would do it. But there's a lot of different ways to go about that one. I don't personally do that all the time just because I've had a couple different dark beers that didn't really go the way I want, so I've definitely put that one on pause so it's a little bit more cost effective that way. But yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. Well, it's hard too. I think a lot of darker beers need the additional body they get from all the grains as well. So
yeah, and for those styles, I would recommend doing a lot more unmalted. So like your unmalted buckwheat, your unmalted millet, unmalted rice. those are going to help get those protein contents and that kind of unfermentable sugar introduced into your liquid, which is super vital for getting that finishing gravity up into that, 1.015, 1.025. So.
And you mentioned dry hopping, and hops in general do aid in head retention. What are you doing anything different with the hop schedules for these kinds of beers?
Yeah, so for me, I don't typically tend to add as much hops at the beginning of the boil anymore. I'm typically adding them throughout the boil, so that if I'm tasting, if I'm pulling off a little bit, let's say like 30 minutes, and I'm already noticing that it's getting to that bitter place that I wanted to be already, well, then I'm just not really going to add much more. But I'm also not trying to start out, getting into the 100 IBU right away. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I used to be a little bit of a hop head, and I've had some good success with it, but I think that I get a cleaner hop taste if I'm adding smaller increments throughout the boil, at least with gluten-free brewing.
Interesting. And are you doing whirlpool hopping or dry hopping like you might with a traditional beer?
Absolutely, yeah. I love whirlpooling. I think it's great, especially when I like to. I've found some success using higher alpha acid hops too, and adding those at the end of the boil. You still get a good amount of that bitter extraction, but you also get a lot more of that aromatic and a lot more of those, other, I guess radicals or free radicals or variables from the hops.
And you mentioned we talked a little bit about the issues with head retention. Are you doing anything different when you carbonate gluten-free beer, or is it just the traditional methods?
Yeah. So, when it comes to bottle conditioning, same process, that process is there for a reason. Kegging is a little bit different. Yeah. Especially if they are really low body. I would say, instead of being at 15 PSI, you might want to be closer to 20 for certain styles, like especially saisons. When it comes to like wit styles or even lagers, sometimes I'm over carbonating at that level. So I typically like to go, kind of lower, more at like 10, 12, and then, ramp it up so I don't foam the beer, which has happened a couple times.
So, I mean, in general, though, you do push it a little bit higher, right, to get a little more head retention and bubble. It probably adds to the mouthfeel as well, I would imagine, if you carbonate it highly, right?
It does, yes. And, I think a lot of the people that are used to the more widespread or well-known beers, it's an easy transition. They're like, oh, wow, this tastes very similar to what I'm used to.
Well, that leads me right into my next question, which is how do people react to your gluten-free beers?
Great question. Well, there's different ways of doing it. I've had a lot of really popular beers that I brewed. My friends, family, all those types of people have really given me some great reviews on it. I mean, I brewed a spruce beer for Christmas for my family, and had people, drinking multiples of it and loving it. So yeah, I think it's been doing pretty well for me. I took last year I took third place at the LA County Fair for an IPA that I did. And then I just took second place at Groundbreakers gluten-free homebrewing competition in Portland for a Bock that I did. So it's been very well received. I think that for me also, I tend to do styles or brew the beer in such a way that most people haven't experienced it before.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think that does give me a little bit of a bump because they don't have a lot of taste conception for people doing that anyways. Like, I think one of the more popular ones that I've done recently is like a guava wit or a passion fruit pale ale. And so, people are like, wow, I've never heard of that. let me get a drink of that. And then usually like, wow, this is incredible. But then again, I've also had like, lagers where people are like, oh man, this reminds me just of like this one or this style. So it is pretty good. I think one of the things that I can say from having been on this side of the fence now is that, it's still true that two of the largest flavor components in, making a beer is the yeast you choose and the hops you choose.
Yeah, absolutely. And the water, actually.
Oh, so much. Yeah. I mean, that changed things so significantly. The moment I started adding more calcium chloride to my mashes, the more of that malt expression I got. And that's really what I had been looking for, in the first place. Primarily because when you start with extract or you get into, using rice as a base malt, there is that incredible dryness that a lot of times really leaves you going, oh wait, I'm not really getting much grain taste or malt taste. So that is one of the things that I've really enjoyed about bringing that water chemistry aspect into my process.
So you're playing with the sulfate to chloride ratio, I assume, by driving the chloride a little bit higher, right?
Yes,
yeah.
Definitely.
You entered a number of these in competition. Do you enter them into regular competitions, gluten-free competitions? How do you categorize them?
I wish there was more gluten-free competitions. And, all gluten-free breweries that are listening to this, I'm coming for you. But I do enter into a lot of regular competitions because one of the things that I have noticed is that there's pretty much one category that this fits in, and it's 31A, alternative grains. However, that category you can also enter rye beers into. So if I'm already going up against a barley beer in a category that's an alternative grain category, well, why not enter into regular categories at that point? And that's actually where that IPA that took third place, I just entered into the regular IPA category. Where I did, I think one of the things that I've learned about competitions that's incredibly important at the homebrew level is to not marry yourself to the style until you taste it and bottle it, and taste it even from the bottle. Because a lot of times, what you thought was an American IPA is really an English IPA, or vice versa. Or, hey, this isn't actually a double IPA. This is actually a barley wine or a millet wine. So that's a huge thing. Putting it in the right category just in general is always a good policy. And, I think one of the things that, may end up happening, and I'm hoping this could be a byproduct of, now having different gluten-free homebrewing clubs popping up everywhere, more gluten-free breweries popping up everywhere. I know that a lot of these breweries are already complaining that their double IPA is being judged next to a fruit beer, next to a Saison, and next to a Doppelbock. And so you're like, okay, well, how is it possible to be able to tell what's the best one of those when they're so diverse and they're all relegated to basically one category? So there's something that's got to give. I mean, I'm not saying like, let's do two Christmases, but at the same time, I think there could be some more nuance potentially provided by the BJCP.
Are there a lot of craft breweries popping up that are making, 100% gluten-free beer from some of these alternative grains?
Actually, yes. And it's a lot bigger than even I thought. So I've recently started going a little bit more in depth into this. And the company called Gluten Beer, I think, they just took first place at the Craft Beer Cup, and they're out of Atlanta. And then there's Departed Souls out of Jersey City. There's Alt Brew out of Wisconsin. There's Holidaily out of Colorado. Coors even has an all 100% gluten-free rice lager now available in certain states. And then you look at the Pacific Northwest, and that's where most of the innovation came from. Groundbreaker and Ghostfish were basically the two American ones that were on my radar first. And they're very much pioneers in the space. And then if you look at the Portland area specifically, there's now 3 more new breweries that are in that area. So you've got Beerly, you've got Moon Shrimp, and you've got Evasion now all in that Oregon area. So that's incredible to see. And I think that, I guess the other place would be Canada, which has Glutenberg.
Glutenberg, huh?
Yeah.
That's awesome. Love it. That's an awesome name. Yeah.
Yeah. They really put a lot of creativity into this, you can tell.
Well, Robert, we're getting to the end, but can you finish with a couple of your top tips on gluten-free brewing, and also maybe a little bit about where folks can learn a little bit more?
Yeah. So my first tip would be creative as possible. Be as creative as possible. There really is no set flavor, taste, anything. I mean, I've seen people. Not only have I seen crazy stuff like chestnuts and lentils, I've also seen things like chanterelle mushrooms. So let's push the limits on what we really call a beer here. I mean, as long as you're kind of, using some sort of a malt and some sort of a hop and yeast and water, well, you're pretty much making a beer. So, don't feel restricted or like you have to brew something that's like what you've had before, because already you're getting a lot of different flavors from these grains in the first place. So play around. There's certain times where I haven't been able to do the same recipe. Even if I'm doing like for like switches. So, be as creative as possible. Second tip would be don't be afraid of buckwheat. It's an incredible grain. It really, really helps with increasing that enjoyment from the end product of the beer that you're looking for, that head retention, the body, all of that is incredible. And also has a nice little spiciness to it as well. Last thing would be use enzymes. Just don't be afraid. I've not used enzymes before, and I've got back and gotten and taken a gravity sample after 3 hours of mashing and been at 009 and gone, what happened in the last 3 hours? So that would be a recommendation of mine is, these enzymes are all gluten-free, and most of them are vegan as well. So you're not really dealing with some sort of, issue there. A lot of these are naturally occurring enzymes as well. So you don't have to feel like you're, using some sort of GMO, as it were.
And where can folks learn more about this?
Yes. So Homebrew Talk is a great place. That's where I've learned a lot. Glutenfreehomebrewing.com also has tutorials on their website, which are incredible. They can be a little bit, technical. So, I guess, be okay with the content being a little dry, but it's incredibly informational. And then I would say that, if people have any questions as well, I also have a couple articles published on homebrewtalk.com. Couple titles are like, making high gravity gluten-free beers, as well as getting more body in your gluten-free beers. I also have a holiday article on gluten-free brewing. So there's a lot that's available there. And then there's different, there's a lot of new blogs popping up. There's a lot of different people that are trying to contribute to the space, because it is a very undercovered space, and an undersaturated market for sure.
Well, Robert, thank you so much for being on the show. I've been trying for some time now to find somebody to come on and talk about gluten-free homebrewing, which I don't know that much about. Thanks for coming on. We really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure, Brad. I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk about this. I know that there's a lot of confusion going on right now, and to be able to be there for those people that are really kind of curious, or like, what the heck is gluten even? I'm happy with all those questions. So it's incredible. And thank you for this opportunity, Brad.
Well, thanks again. Again, my guest today was Robert Keifer. He's a specialist in gluten-free brewing. Thanks again, Robert.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Robert Keifer for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue is packed with great information for homebrewers and craft beer fans. Take advantage of their fantastic sale and get 20% off when you use the offer code BeerSmith2018 at beerandbrewing.com. And also Blickman Engineering, creators of the innovative new BrewVision wireless thermometer. Remotely monitor your brewing system from your iPhone or iPad, record data, set alerts, and grab recipes directly from the BeerSmith cloud. The BrewVision thermometer, another great innovation from BlickmanEngineering.com. And finally, BeerSmith Mobile. The mobile version of BeerSmith is a perfect complement to our desktop brewing software. Check out BeerSmith Mobile at beersmith.com/mobile or on the Google Play, iTunes, or Amazon app stores. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a great brewing week.